For the higher education or HE sector, it may be starting to feel like one step forward is almost immediately followed by one step backward. Last year, the announcement of a rise in tuition fees in line with inflation was accompanied by a large increase in taxes on employers, including HE providers, which probably wiped out some, if not all, the extra fee income. This year, the decision to again raise fees in line with inflation was accompanied by a brand new tax on HE providers in the form of an international student levy. Needless to say, this new levy comes at a time when many universities and other providers are known to be struggling financially, and that's before you even consider potential problems with the levy itself. So what is this new international student levy? Are there likely to be winners and losers in different parts of the HE sector following the levy's introduction? And are there ways that the levy could potentially be improved, or should the sector just keep fighting against it regardless? My guests are Rose Stevenson, the Director of Policy and Strategy at the Higher Education Policy Institute, and Chris Havergal, the Editor of Times Higher Education. I'm Tom Richmond, and to find out why this new tax on international students could be very taxing for the HE sector, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Rose, we have now seen the details of the new international student levy, which we will discuss in just a moment, of course, but the levy has already been on a bit of a journey up to this point in terms of its purpose and rationale. So how would you describe the political backdrop to this new levy?
So this is quite interesting from a politics nerd perspective. So there's actually two separate issues going on here. Those are immigration and Labour's opportunity mission. So if we touch on immigration first, and there is almost zero nuance on this conversation, immigration just equals bad. Other than perhaps the Green Party a little bit and the SNP in Scotland, all other parties, immigration equals bad. And all of immigration is therefore lumped together. So a lot of the anti-immigration rhetoric and immigration politics is driven by the pictures we see of the small boats coming over the channel. And that's a really tricky problem to solve. And it's actually much easier to lower the number of international students and say, we're dealing with immigration. It's not really dealing with the political problem, which is the small boats, but that's where we are. So that's number one point, immigration. The second political problem we have been dealt with here is Labour's opportunity mission. So they set out very clearly when they came into power, they wanted to break down the barriers to opportunity for every child at every stage. And they talk about shattering the class ceiling. And the Secretary of State for Education likes to talk about your background should not impact on your future. And unfortunately, we know that increasingly it does in terms of higher education. So we know, for example, that around 6% of home students are making their choice of institution or course based on financial decisions. So they're not choosing their first course, they're choosing where they might be able to afford to go or afford to live. And we know, for example, again, that students who are working more than 20 hours are less likely to get a good honours degree. So there's a problem with the cost of living for students, and they're trying to solve two political problems at once. And perhaps that's where we're running into difficulty. So the levy says that international students will be charged an amount of money, and that will be used to fund maintenance grants for the poorest students in the UK. So that's where we are. Unfortunately, those grants are going to be very small. So we think about £1,000 per student for the poorest students, and also only on specific courses that align with the government's industrial strategy. So I think Wonky have coined the phrase offering not a lot to very few. in terms of these grants, which is spot on, really. So not quite solving the problem of immigration that it's setting out to solve, and not quite solving the problem of opportunity in education.
Okay, so two problems they're trying to solve, and they might not be solving either of them particularly well, but we'll definitely pick up that maintenance grant point, I'm sure. Chris, the government has just published a consultation outlining the details of the levy and how it is supposed to work. So what exactly is the International Student Levy, and is it going to raise much money for the government?
Well, the details are quite different to what we originally expected. We first heard about the levy in the immigration white paper, and the suggestion then was that we'd have a percentage-based levy, probably 6% of international student income, and that would have cost the sector about £600 million. Actually seeing now the consultation is quite different. It's a flat fee per international student per year of study from 2028 to 29 onwards. The fee they've gone with is £925. Significantly, there is an exclusion as well. The first 220 students are exempted from the levy, so very small recruiters of international students won't have to pay anything at all. In terms of how much that's likely to cost the sector, probably about £445 million is the estimate that the government's provided, and that will grow a little bit over following years. But the government's done some modelling where it thinks that universities will be able to pass on about half of the cost of the levy onto students in terms of increased fees. So that would still leave the sector with a cost of about, according to the government's modelling, about £270 million, again rising to about £330 million over the following years. That's about 3% of the sector's total international fee income. Significantly, though, as Rose has said, the idea, and to quote, the levy will be fully reinvested into higher education and skills, including in those maintenance grants. So it may be that some of the things that the sector is paying for currently in terms of widening access, some institutions might think that they're able now to pass that cost back to the government.
Okay, let's pick up this point around the way that the levy has apparently changed over time. We were expecting a percentage-based levy, thought to be around 6% of fees, but we've ended up with a flat fee of £925. Chris, I saw that the Times Higher Education reported recently that when looking at these two different options for a levy, a flat fee would, quote, disproportionately benefit elite research-intensive institutions in England. Now, you've already mentioned this proposed exemption for very small providers, but that leaves an awful lot of HE providers, including big universities who have large international student populations, in line for a potentially huge levy bill. I was seeing sums on your website of 5, 10, maybe even £20 million per institution. So it looks to me as if the sector itself might not necessarily be united on what kind of levy they really wanted to see. Is that a fair observation?
No, I mean, unity has been in very short supply on this issue. What we did at THE was we modelled what the effect of switching from 6% to a £1,000 flat fee would be, but they've gone for 925. It's actually even better for the Russell Group. The Russell Group are still some of the biggest payers here. They recruit large numbers of international students, but the significance of changing to the flat fee is that the Russell Group are typically able to charge higher fees. So a percentage levy could lead to some quite large charges, especially on valuable courses such as MBAs. What our modelling found was that switching to £1,000 would have saved the Russell Group about £100 million compared to what was originally proposed. And some of the biggest institutions would actually save an awful lot of money. In the case of UCL, about £15 million. The flip side of that is that less prestigious institutions, which still recruit a decent number of international students, could see some quite significant increases in cost from where they originally were. And again, there's some big numbers. Hertfordshire, about £7.5 million. Greenwich, about £4.5 million. So, the Russell Group will still be some of the biggest players, but in terms of if we accept that the argument essentially has been the sector's lost the argument about whether this is going to happen or not, in terms of the argument of how it should happen in practice, the Russell Group have won that round.
Very interesting. Rose, what do you make of this apparent change of heart from the government from a percentage-based levy to a flat fee levy? Are there good policy reasons to make this shift, or do you see something else happening here?
It's such a good question, Tom. And I'm slightly fascinated by the reasoning for making this choice. So if I was setting out to make a policy on, I want to bring in targeted maintenance grants for some students, I expect I would do some modelling to work out how much money I would need and work out what I was going to do from there. But the change that we've seen from the 6% to the flat fee This stat might be slightly out of date with the detail we have now, but it's going to save the sector, we think, about 37 million. That's quite a lot of money. If you needed that money for the maintenance grants and now you don't have it, what does that look like? So I'm interested in that thought process of quite how this policy was put together. And there is a little feeling of back of a fag packet here with that switch from one methodology to another. The government's lost £37 million there. So yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think we have to remember we only saw this floated for the first time in May. So this has been quite a quick process. And in May, I don't think anybody thought the government was actually going to do this. So it's been quite a quick turnaround to where we are now. And I'm not 100% convinced this is set in stone at this point. I think there are people in the sector that believe there is still a bit of room for negotiation and discussion.
Well, let's look at this issue of how the sector has reacted, because as we were saying, this levy changing from a percentage base to a flat fee does have big implications depending on where you sit in the sector. But that's created quite a lot of disagreement, and there's been disagreement within the sector about how to respond to the levy in general as well. So, for example, speaking before the budget, Vivian Stern, the chief executive of Universities UK, said the government was naive for proposing a levy on international students, while Duncan Iverson, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manchester, said the levy was wrong and it will hurt the sector. However, Malcolm Press, the Vice-Chancellor of Manchester Metropolitan University and the Chair of Universities UK, struck a very different tone when speaking to Times Higher Education just after the budget, saying, quote, "We need to proceed very cautiously. I think it's incumbent upon the sector now not to continue arguing vociferously and vehemently about this, because if we do, it will cause damage to the appeal of the UK as a destination choice for international students. Instead of that, I think we need to continue adult, sensitive conversations with government about the potential unintended consequences of the levy." Chris, what do you make of Malcolm's comments? Is he right to wave the white flag on the levy itself, or will that be seen in the sector as too defeatist?
I suppose the one quote you didn't throw in there was Jackie Smith when she was talking, I think it was at the Guild HE conference, when she was saying that people who are criticising the levy, I think she said she wanted to run for the hills when she heard that criticism, the government having found some extra money to put into the sector at a very constrained financial time. I certainly don't think I'd come down on Jackie Smith's point of view. It's hard to argue that universities should just stop complaining and sort of roll over when if you look at Universities UK analysis, teaching income for the sector as a whole is down about £6 billion in real terms over the last decade. And this is another imposition on the sector, which is going to make it a lot harder for financially challenged institutions to survive, but also to deliver on the government's objectives. In terms of Malcolm's perspective, I do sort of take the view that maybe this argument now, the sector has sort of lost the argument over the principle of the levy, and perhaps some of the arguments need to happen in a more constructive, quiet, behind closed doors environment, at least for the next little while, because Malcolm's right that there's a question of price sensitivity of students around whether the UK is welcoming international students. But I think perhaps more importantly than that, I'd actually go back to where Rose started earlier in terms of just the toxicity of immigration as an issue for government, but also for the relationship between government and universities. I think issues, if you think around the number of asylum claims being submitted by students, the universities which have pivoted to offering MRes courses apparently in a way to get round restrictions on bringing dependents into the UK. I think for some ministers, these add to a perception that the university sector is not serious about tackling immigration, an issue which is absolutely totemic for this government. And if there's a big falling out now over the levy, the risk is that it leads to further punitive action against the university sector that could actually be much more damaging, primarily probably in the abolition of the graduate visa, which would be really damaging for universities' international recruitment.
Yes, plenty of political trade-offs here, I'm sure. Rose, what do you think the sector should do at this point? Should opponents of the levy just make peace with it and accept their fate, do you think?
I think it's very difficult when some institutions are struggling so much financially to see essentially a tax on international students. For some institutions will be a massive challenge. I still think there is a level of naivety about what will happen if a large institution does go under, particularly if that is a one university town. in terms of the number of students who need moving to another course or compensating for what they've paid so far. Universities are huge employers in towns and cities, and the number of people who would lose their job in one go, the kind of brain drain from that town, the number of other businesses, the nighttime economy, etc., and how all of those pieces of that puzzle would struggle. And I don't know if it just feels so unbelievable that a decent-sized institution could go under, but we know from, for example, the recent OFS financial report that there are a number of institutions that really are struggling, and that was done before this levy was applied. So, our institutions aren't going to sit back and stop debating this and discussing this and pushing on it if this is the thing that's going to keep their institution afloat.
Well, the government have certainly been keen to placate some parts of the sector and potentially try and win over some critics by talking about these maintenance grants that you mentioned earlier, Rose. So let's dig into this issue, because we are still awaiting some details on exactly which students are going to get these grants, particularly for priority courses, we're told, although we still haven't got details of what that's going to include. But the government's new consultation did reiterate, apparently, that all these levy funds will be reinvested in the higher education system, and these maintenance grants could be a big winner. Chris, you mentioned those wonderful comments from Jackie Smith shortly before the budget, which I think I have to quote in full because it's just so fantastic. She said at the conference, "If I hear one more person say to me, given the financial challenges that we face as a department, we're really keen on the maintenance response, but we're really not that happy about the international student levy, without providing any solution to where they think the money should come from, I will probably run screaming." Rose, Chris didn't sound like he was very happy with that as a position, really. What do you make of Jackie Smith saying that actually the HE sector, it was incumbent on them to come up with a better plan, and because they didn't, that the government is right to push ahead with this trade-off? What do you think?
So in terms of lobbying, it's always better to go with an idea than just complain about the idea that already exists. And I think that perhaps is Jackie's point. But this is, we've done oodles of work at HEPI in terms of financial sustainability for the sector and different funding models. And it's really difficult. There really isn't much public funding available. And if there was, it probably wouldn't come to the higher education sector. You can't really push more onto graduates. Graduates in England pay a massive amount for their higher education compared to other countries. So there isn't an easy answer here. And I've been quite mean, really, about the politics behind this and how these decisions have come together. But I do think there is something clever here with taking away with one hand, but giving back with the other. So that provision for maintenance grants, which we all really desperately want to see for those students who are struggling. I think Chris's comments were really interesting, that institutions now who may have slightly less money, whether they're going to pull back, for example, on hardship funds because they feel like this has been dealt with by the government. So those students aren't actually going to be any better off. So it's going to be a really interesting one to watch. But if something doesn't change, and we are going to see that continued drop-off and that continued decision-making by the poorest students, either not to go or to live at home or to do a different course because they just don't have the money to do what they might otherwise want to.
So in that regard, do you think that maintenance grants are going to have a significant effect on the ground, or it sounds as though you're not convinced the scale is going to be enough to make much of a difference anyway?
I don't think £1,000 a year, and that's only for the very poorest students, is going to make a huge amount of difference. Students, even when they've got that, are still going to be looking at almost all of that being eaten by their rent costs straight away. So when students are sat at home deciding where they might go to university and they look up the cost of their halls and they think, well, that's 80, 90, 95% of my maintenance loan and grant gone. That student is in the bracket where they're getting the most money, so they're not supposed to have any financial backing from their families. They might make the decision just not to go, or they're going, they're finding they don't have any money, and then they're working so many hours that it really is having an impact on their studies. And I don't want to poo-poo the idea of maintenance grants coming back because it's really important, but for the amount of pain this is causing, I'm not sure it's going to have the impact that government would wish it to.
Chris, I saw that the Institute for Fiscal Studies delivered a particularly damning verdict on this whole levy maintenance grant link, saying that there is, quote, no meaningful sense in which the revenues raised from this levy will pay for the reintroduction of maintenance grants for some students, as government has claimed. And yet Jackie Smith has been very keen to praise Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson for using this new levy to bring back the maintenance grants. So should we be applauding the government here, or should we be criticising them for using the levy in this way? What's your take?
I mean, it's certainly quite a clever political move. I think tying together the levy and the maintenance grants has made it much harder for Labour MPs to argue against it as a policy. When we talk about how different parts of the sector might be affected, and we've talked about the Russell Group and the rest, actually, if you think about the geography, it's primarily going to be universities and seats represented by Labour MPs in big cities who tend to recruit lots of international students who will be affected. The return of maintenance grants is a key priority for them, and clearly for Bridget Phillipson as well. And arguably this policy has quite a lot to do with the fact that Bridget Phillipson was running for deputy leader of the Labour Party when it was announced, as much as the policy drivers that it's hoping to achieve. Tying those together has also made it much harder for vice-chancellors to criticise the levy. They've certainly had to caveat their criticism with a recognition that everyone wants to see the return of maintenance grants. But I'd agree with Rose that these grants are barely going to touch the side of a student cost of living crisis, both in terms of the value, but also in terms of the eligibility for them. To have the full grants, I think you need to have a family income of around £25,000 per annum. Even to get half of it, you need £30,000. Those aren't, in terms of family earnings these days, those are not huge amounts. And that, especially when you combine that with the fact that this is limited to an as yet unspecified list of courses, that not only limits the impact that these grants are going to have on the sector, it also possibly affects how this could land politically. And it could actually not be as transformative as ministers hope, and it could actually be quite divisive if you are from one side of an income bracket to the other. Suddenly the amount of support available is very different. But also if you want to study a course like, for example, English, history, still courses, for example, have hugely important skills. We need graduates from those courses to go into the economy. You could find you're not getting any grant at all, whereas someone who just has chosen a different course gets the full support, and that could actually turn out to be quite divisive and then affect how this policy lands in practice.
You mentioned this issue of backbench Labour MPs, so part of the governing party, but obviously still free to speak their mind. Is there a danger, Chris, that if the government gets on the wrong side of some of these Labour MPs who sit in university towns, for example, and they start to see these calculations come through about the possible losses from the levy, do you sense there is a potential risk here that the tide might turn even before the levy comes in 2028?
Yeah, I mean, that's a long time in politics, and I'd agree with Rose, this isn't necessarily all set in stone. The political environment can change in that time. Also, the international student recruitment environment can change in that time. We know it's quite a strange policy solution that you seek to achieve one of your primary policy goals by leaning on something that's a very volatile, unpredictable source of income. What we still don't know really how the levy is going to affect international student demand. We've seen some modelling, but you never know about these things until they happen in practice. And if clearly there's a very volatile geopolitical situation as well, if international student recruitment declines and then the amount of income that the levy brings in isn't as much as we expect, we don't know what the situation is going to be then. So I don't think not only would that be politically difficult, I think it would just make it very difficult for the government to achieve what it wanted to achieve from this policy.
OK, we are nearly at the end of this episode, so it's time for my last question. The government's consultation on the international student levy is now live and runs until February 2026, so there is still time, as we discussed today, for people and providers to share their views on what ministers have proposed, although, as always with these sorts of consultations, it is unclear exactly how dramatic any future changes to the levy might be. But let's look on the bright side. Let's say there is an opportunity here to improve the levy through this consultation. So my question is, if you could change one element or feature of the international student levy to make the levy a better policy, in your view, what would you change about it and why? Rose, what one thing would you like to change about this new levy?
So the detail that we have now says that any institution can have 220 students that don't pay the levy, and then everybody else does, or that one presumes a university has to work that out between their international students. From an implementation point of view, I'm quite confused about the 220 students. How will a university sort that out? Will the first 220 that sign up don't have to pay the levy? Or do you have to guess how many international students you're going to have that year and kind of fudge a figure backwards the other way? But what that 220 students mean is that very small universities, very small institutions will probably be fine from this. They won't have many international students. And we've already talked about the large research intensives have done quite well out of the flat fee. So you end up with a kind of a squeezed middle. So your large kind of post-92, again, often the only institution in their towns for many of them, are going to be the ones that maybe hit the hardest. So I normally like a simple policy, which this isn't, but my suggestion is this: instead of having the 220 students, that there is a percentage of your overall student body that you may have as international students who don't pay the levy. And if you go beyond that percentage, then those students pay the levy. So if we look at economically developed countries across the world, the average percentage of international students in a student body is about 7%. And in the UK, it's really high. It's 23%, which is great. It's because people want to come here. And, we know there are many, many benefits of having international students. So perhaps the government want to think about a figure that might sit between the average and where the UK is, and decide what would a really healthy percentage of international students be at an institution, and what might we charge for the students that go beyond that percentage. I would need to see the modelling. I'm going to caveat my answer with that, but I think it's a better idea than the 220 flat figure.
A very interesting proposal to protect the squeezed middle. Thank you, Rose. Chris, pick one thing that you think needs to change about this levy.
Well, I suppose we spent a lot of this podcast talking about how maintenance grants might not necessarily deliver the change that we'd hoped for in widening access. I suppose something we could consider is, could we spend this revenue on something else? One thing the government's been clear on in the skills white paper is that it wants to see greater specialisation, greater collaboration between institutions, and much more sort of sharing of services and innovation to try and make the sector run more efficiently. The problem is that a lot of that work costs money, and the government hasn't proposed any levers really in the skills white paper that would allow the government to support universities or steer them towards that sort of outcome. Why don't we spend the money on a transformation fund for the sector that universities would perhaps be able to bid into to support new collaborations, new ways of working, new models of delivering teaching and research that might actually end up delivering a bigger benefit for students than maintenance grants, which aren't really going to touch the sides and could easily be funded by other changes to the student finance system, a much more progressive student finance system, which wouldn't cost the government anything more than it does currently and would allow you to then put some funds into grants. Maybe if you could deliver something that the sector bought into as a real win from the levy, would allow the sector to buy into it in a much bigger way.
Thank you, Chris. And that brings us to the end of this episode. A huge thank you to Chris and Rose for talking us through the new International Student Levy, which as it stands will be coming to a university near you in 2028. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.